and Jonathan. And
You're welcome.
We're gonna go to our last talk of the day, and this talk is a joint talk between three professors in North America. So we have, and I hope, yeah, I can see Jacqueline now connected. So Professor Jacqueline Hebert at the University of Alberta. Then we have Jon Sensinger at the University of New Brunswick, and Paul Marasco at the Cleveland Clinic. And they've been working on something that was very much needed in the field, and is a way to measure if our prosthetics actually improve function. And I'm sure you're going to talk about this, but from my viewpoint, we have this ceiling effect in prosthesis, because most of the outcome measures done for prosthetic devices are designed for very rudimentary prosthesis. And now that we have these neurally controlled devices, we get to the top of those outcomes measures, and we need something that is more sophisticated for the kind of sophisticated prosthesis we're developing. So I hope I didn't ruin your introduction, but thanks a lot for joining us, and I'll let you the floor.
Great, thank you very much, Max. Thanks for the invitation, and it's so exciting to be here with my great colleagues Jacqueline and Jon, and actually your comment was a great setup, and not necessary and perfectly in line with where we're at. And so with that, we actually have a lot to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive in, and we'll move through relatively quickly. So really to that question that you asked, Max, it's like, how do we provide evidence that all of these great systems that we've been looking at today, how do we provide evidence that these actually provide benefits over standard of care? And as you mentioned, we're really constrained by this idea of time-based performance metrics. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Oops. There we go. And so, we'll talk about the system that we work in, that we're most comfortable with, and it's really it's a sort of a broad system that has multiple motor and sensing modalities. So everyone's familiar with targeted motor reinnervation. We use that as our control interface. We also use targeted sensory reinnervation as our touch interface, and presumably everyone's relatively familiar with that as well. And then the other piece of this puzzle that we use is actually targeted sensory reinnervation of the muscle for kinesthesia. And this is a little bit different. This is work that we've done earlier, where we actually use perceptual movements, vibration-induced perceptual movement, vibration-induced perceptual movement illusions that are actually projected to the missing limb. And we get these highly complex synergistic grip percepts. So buried inside the muscle in the reinnervated afferents, the sensory afferents that have actually been alluded to multiple times in previous talks, there's actually the information about actual volitional control, like the outcomes of volitional movement. And these are actually represented as these highly complex dexterous finger movements. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so what we've done is we've taken all of these components, all these sensory motor components, and then we've actually integrated them all simultaneously in a bidirectional neural machine interface, essentially in a prosthetic limb. And the prosthetic limb, it feels touch, it has intentional movement, and then it also provides that movement of the prosthesis back to the user. And this all runs simultaneously, essentially in a neural robotic interface. And so they think about moving, they feel the touch when their hands contact thing, and the position and the movement of their hand is actually is read back to them as they engage in the actions. Go ahead and move to the next one. And so, this is that big question, right? It's incredibly difficult to quantify these advanced sensory motor systems. And and Max, you hit it right on the head, right? We're using metrics that were really designed for traditional prostheses, and they often come from different fields to try and quantify the functionality of these highly complex dexterous and sensory systems. And they just don't, it's hard for you to demonstrate to insurance companies, to payers, to all the interested parties that these things really actually make a difference and help people. And so really, what we wanted to do is say, how do we understand how the brain is actually interacting with these systems? And what we did is built a complementary suite of 5 functional metrics, and they focus on the features that are actually salient to sensory motor bionics, right? It's these questions of the things that we've been exploring, that we've all been examining, that we've all been touching on, and like saying, what is it that really makes a difference from the perspective of the sensory motor system? And then we took these metrics and we actually, what we're most excited about is that instead of building a metric and then saying, okay, does this thing work? Does everybody approve of it? What we actually did is we went in and we came at this from the perspective of advanced psychophysics, computational motor control, mathematics from evolutionary ecology, advanced kinematics, essential attention, like attention, or what I want to say. So anyway, how your attention operates. And what we did is we built a foundational literature underneath each of our individual metrics, and we vetted these out in the scientific communities, the interested scientific communities, previously to, as we were developing the metrics themselves. So that all of these pieces actually rest on the foundational scientific, on a foundational scientific foundation, or on a scientific foundation that actually had to pass muster in some really quite difficult situations. And people who are experts in these places and had no idea what prosthetics were about, and we're really digging in on like how these are actually operating and what things are doing. So we can go ahead and jump to the next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline as we present a subset of our metrics.
Great, thanks, Paul. So the metric I'm going to describe that we used was the Gaze and Movement Assessment, or GaMA, and this was developed at the University of Alberta here with some of my collaborators. So GaMA involves administering a standardized protocol that uses motion and eye tracking while participants perform an object movement task. So the collected kinematic data actually allows us to track the movements of the body, the hand, and objects within the environment. And then this is represented here in our custom analysis software on the left of the video. And then using the eye movement data, we can actually reconstruct a three-dimensional gaze vector, which is that red line you see sort of shooting out of the person's head. But what that allows us to do is calculate the precise interactions of the gaze with objects in the environment. And you can see that as the gaze is flicking to different targets or to the hand, that area is lighting up. So it's just a visualization of what our software can do. So these participants are performing the cups task, which has 4 specific cup movements of a compliant cup filled with beads, so there's some risk involved. And although the kinematic movements are a bit different for each cup movement, we've actually shown that eye fixation is very stereotypical across all of the movements combined. So in the top video, you can see the normative eye behavior, which really consistently demonstrates just very brief glances at the hand when they're picking up an object. And most visual allocation is allocated to the next upcoming target or placement location. And this is in contrast to prosthesis users, where we know and we've shown that prosthesis users tend to visually fixate on the hand, particularly when they're grasping or moving objects. And this is at the expense of actually not being able to look ahead to the next target of action. So it's really consuming their cognitive resources. So, sorry, I'm having trouble advancing. So the idea is that if you provide more appropriate channels of sensory feedback, visual motor behavior should be more natural, and therefore visual fixation to the hand should be reduced when you give them relevant sensory feedback. So specifically with our participants, typically when you're reaching for a cup without any feedback, you have to look at the hand to ensure that the grip aperture is open and you're going to accurately grasp the cup. And then during transport, the prosthesis user without feedback needs to continue staring at the cup so they don't, inadvertently crush it. But with feedback, you should be able to sense when you're in contact with the cup. So with the touch feedback and then with kinesthetic feedback, you should be aware of the position of the hand and therefore be informed of any inadvertent grip closure. And so the results show that both participants perform the cup transfer task. And this is particularly demanding for visual attention, as I mentioned. So in this graph, the dash line and the purple sort of represents the normative median fixation and interquartile range. So you can see with SD trials on the left, with motor, there was a high fixation to the hand and this is when reaching with objects. And then when we added touch, and touch was kinesthesia, there was a significant reduction in the visual fixation on the hand. And this was also shown for our transhumeral participant, but although his visual fixations were quite low. And then when you look at transport, you see even more substantially that there was significantly less visual fixation to the hand during that transport condition when the participant was provided with kinesthesia and touch compared to touch alone and compared to the motor condition. And a similar significance was seen in the transhumeral participant. Then the second task that we looked at was the passive box transfer task. And this task was more designed to challenge kinematics, but this first movement requires the participant to go to the side, grab a box, and then look ahead to the shelf that they're placing on it. So this first movement is quite challenging, and SD was able to perform this task. And so what we were able to show that percent visual fixation, again, with this is the amount that they were looking at the hand. So there was a reduction. So if you go from just motor to touch and to touch plus kinesthesia, it was almost down to normal, the amount of fixations to the hand. And then when you look at the how much the visual allocation was able to free to the next target. So normally people are 80% of the time looking ahead at the next target. And again, you saw a significant increase in the visual allocation. So that means that these corresponding look ahead fixations to the next target location were significantly improved with touch plus kinesthesia feedback. So these quantitative GaMA results really allow us to clearly show that when you're adding relevant sensory feedback, it can restore more normal averaged visual motor behavior across different movements. So now I'm going to move it on to Jon.
Sorry about that. So I'll tell you about two other metrics that we've also been looking at. And the first one is based on the idea that we adapt all of the time. And you can think of this as microlearning. It's subconscious, doesn't have anything to do with whether you're trying to adapt or not. And it turns out this microlearning or this adaptation is proportional to how reliable your control is. And so this is great for prosthetics because, as we know, as we make the control more reliable, we should see more adaptation. But it also turns out that this adaptation is proportional to how much we trust feedback. And so if we keep all the conditions the same, if we keep the control the same, and we introduce new layers of feedback, we can see if the level of adaptation improves, and that will give us a quantitative proxy for how much the person is subconsciously, without even knowing they're doing it, incorporating in that feedback into the decisions they make, even though they may already have other feedback available to them, such as visual feedback. And so the way that we did this, many of you, if you think back to your school days, probably did a ruler test where you drop a ruler and you see if you can catch it at a given length. So we had a formalized ruler drop test where subjects were asked to catch the ruler specifically at a matching target location. And it was instrumented so we could quantify everything. And as I mentioned, we can use this to see if the feedback that our particular bidirectional interface was affecting behavior, even though subjects had access to vision, even though they had other feedback in their system, and using our new algorithm. So for this particular metric, we were able to test it out on one subject, the transhumeral subject. We looked at two conditions using only touch feedback and using both touch and kinesthesia feedback. The subject had visual feedback the whole time. 30 trials per condition. And we found that our touch feedback does really well. The adaptation rates are very high for touch feedback, so we were quite happy to see that. But we were even more happy to see that when you add kinesthesia, they do even better. And this result aligns very well with the theory that's behind this metric, where we would have expected kinesthesia feedback to improve their performance, but we see that they are making use of that feedback. So that's great for our bidirectional system, but it also speaks to the validity of the metric itself. Okay, so the second one I want to talk to you about is this idea of embodiment and specifically ownership. And so we know from the literature that if you feel like a prosthesis is part of your own body, you are more likely to wear it, you're more likely to be happy with it, and to not kick it aside when it's making mistakes. So we really want to enhance this sense of ownership, and that's what this next metric measures. The way we do it is a method that I've told many of you in this group about before, called Prosthesis Incorporation, where we prevent congruent and incongruent stimuli, and we measure your response time. It turns out your response time changes depending on if what you feel is congruent or incongruent with what you see. And this aligns perfectly with the definition of incorporation or embodiment, which is that all of your sensations either align or do not align with what you see. And so basically we just measure the difference between the incongruent time and the congruent time, and this is called cross-modal congruency. And then we put it through a function which allows us to factor in the prosthetic conditions. So several of you in this group have heard about this before. The interesting thing in this particular study is that we wanted to expand it a little bit, and so we're calling this new one dynamic. Okay. And in dynamic pick, there's actually a movement before the lights light up. And the question we wanted to ask was, kinesthesia itself should not directly affect ownership, according to the literature, but we thought that it might potentiate ownership, meaning we thought that it might gear you up to believe in ownership more. And so that's the question that we wanted to ask. And actually, I'm kind of, many of you in this group know me as, that person you don't want asking a question, right? Because you're not gonna like the question. And so I've had some skepticism with one of these setups in particular, because there were some hardware difficulties when our particular group was running the software. Some wires were misconnected. And sure enough, the dynamic pick actually went the wrong direction, went down when we added kinesthesia, when the kinesthesia was not aligned with the feedback that it should be providing. And so those of you who know me, know that this is good, because it means the metric is doing what it's supposed to do. It's telling us, yay, things are working great when they're working great, but it's also saying, actually, even though you've got this cool technology, if you cross your wires, the pick score is not working so well. So we see some bad results for SD, but we see quite a dramatic improvement for TH, where we didn't have the wires crossed, where we have a pretty good pick score, but we're getting a much better pick score when we don't have our wires crossed. So I think it's preliminary at this point to say, but I do think that kinesthesia potentiates ownership, meaning if we want people wearing their devices more, if we want them having greater acceptance of their devices, providing that kinesthesia is a great way to do it. And I will pass it over to Paul.
Unmute, Paul. I think you're still on mute, Paul.
Thanks. My controls were missing, so now I'm back. All right. Yeah, so my apologies for that. Yeah, so then we'll dive into one of the metrics that we're working on. And this one's essentially, this is kind of that fundamental question of, is the amount of effort that you have to put in, is it worth the payoff? And it's this question that everybody manages, particularly people with amputation and with prosthetic limbs. Like, how much do you have to hassle with this in order to be able to use it, in order to be able to use it functionally? And so our test, the prosthesis efficiency and profitability, it actually uses mathematics from evolutionary ecology to really sort of drill down on this question of, are you performing optimally? Is your system efficient? Is the whole way that you approach things profitable? Are you going to, it will tell you which way that you're going to go as far as whether your willingness to engage with the system. The really neat thing about it is that it's sensitive to strategy. It's simple to run. All the individual does is sort different durometer blocks, different stiffness blocks out of distractors. So they have to find a medium stiffness block within hard and soft distractors. And so we watch what they do, and we watch the sort of decisions that they make. And each time they squeeze one of those blocks, we extract quite a bit of information about what it is that they're doing each time they grab and touch a block and make a selection. And the nice thing is it's all done with video cameras. There's no real technical aspects to this other than the analysis itself. And one of the exciting things that we find about this is that there were no surprises when you look at this from an efficiency perspective. So if you just do time-based efficiency and how much a person's actually going to engage with the device, you'll notice that those blue triangles there under the body-powered prosthetics actually sit really quite high. Body-powered prosthetics are incredibly functional, right? They're very intuitive and they move fast. And that, you know, and that's often what we stop with, right? And that's when you look at this from the time-based performance metrics, and you know, we always talk about the functionality of body-powered prostheses, but the snag is it's not the whole story. And so, let's see here. Jacqueline, do you mind advancing for me? Thank you. So, you know, beyond just the simple sorting decisions, we can actually look at how people make decisions. And this is a really complex graph, and I'll hopefully boil it down for you. So I'm not sure if any, oops, goodness gracious, now my mouse is working. I'm not sure if anyone can see my mouse, but you've got two different types of errors. You can either take the wrong block or you can throw the right block back. And so from the perspective of the graph itself, it kind of breaks down into the axes themselves. You're actually looking into a ternary plot, and the axes have different functions. And so up and so down from the right up to the left is really sort of how fast, or it reflects taking whatever you can grab the fastest, right? Down here on the left, swinging up to the right, is really you overthinking every decision that you make. And then from the bottom to the top, it's a reflection of your accuracy, how well you actually make those individual these individual decisions. And then there's three important lines. There's a green line up the center, there's a blue line on the right, and then there's a cyan line on the left. And these are actually mathematically defined balance points in the strategies that you are making as an individual when you make a decision to grab a block. You know, did I get the right one? Did I throw the wrong one back? Did I pick the wrong one? And so you've got this place where you can move fast enough over to the left of that cyan. You're overly permissive and you'll just simply grab it and take whatever block you want. Over to the right side of the maximize accuracy line, this blue one, you're overly selective. You're taking too much time to think through the decisions. You're squeezing things. You're not really costing yourself in mistakes, but you're costing yourself in time. And then right up the middle in this balance point between these two different mathematically defined concepts is this balance strategy, where you're kind of splitting the difference between moving too fast and just taking whatever you can get versus taking too much time to actually, you know, think through your decisions. And we find that we can actually look at all of these different populations simultaneously on this graph. And we've got body-powered prostheses, myoelectric transradial prostheses, able-bodied individuals, and then our population, our true shoulder disarticulation transhumeral neural machine interface amputees with different types of their sensation turned on and off. And then an important thing to see about this graph is that you can see that there's this sort of gold, this copper gradient, which reflects the accuracy. And then there's lines that move, these contour lines that move back and forth. And these are actually the lines that represent the mathematics within the plot. And as you move from side to side on each one of these lines, you're actually reflecting a change in strategy, right? This too permissive or this too selective strategy. But then as you move up or across contour lines, that reflects changes in system performance. And so the first thing that we see with our shoulder disarticulation amputee or individual with amputation is that when she has sensation turned off and she's just running this as a myoelectric prosthesis, She actually stratifies down here with the myoelectric users and the body power user, where they're just moving through and just grabbing what they can and just going. And as soon as we turn touch on, she shoots right up to sort of this balanced strategy. So touch clearly has information there. She's clearly using it from a strategic perspective, and she's balancing her strategy like an able-bodied person does. And you'll notice that it crosses multiple, her system performance improves dramatically. And then if we add touch, if we then go further and include kinesthesia with touch, now she can feel the movement in addition to the touch itself. She actually stratifies above all of the other prosthesis users, and actually in the neighborhood, very near 2 standard deviations within the type of strategic decisions that an able-bodied individual makes. So she's making actually able-bodied levels decisions about how she's actually going to engage with the task. And this is the key aspect of the sensory motor prosthetic systems, like these bidirectionally integrated systems. It releases you to begin to behave and intrinsically behave more in an able-bodied fashion versus behaving like someone with a prosthetic limb. And so our metric suite, we have 5. As we mentioned, we only showed you a subset. We've got 5 measures. The thing that we did about this, we have our interface that we were working with as a test bed, but we actually built the metrics themselves to be system agnostic. So, the goal is to actually be able to apply these to any sensory motor interface, any sensory motor upper limb system. And that also includes hand transplantation, stroke, nerve regeneration, nerve damage, anything that has a sensory and motor component to it in the upper limb is something that we feel strongly that we could realistically characterize with these metrics. And with that said, we're happy to collaborate. And so all of these pieces of this puzzle to come together to give us a bigger picture of how people actually operate with these devices. And then I'll turn the last slide over to Jacqueline.
Yeah, just a very quick plug. This has been an amazing conference, and I hope to rewatch the parts that happened at 2 in the morning for me. But please consider looking into the ISPO 18th World Congress Virtual Edition. And now I think we're happy to take questions.
We have one question from the audience.
Yes, and one of our viewers would like to know how potentiation differs from relation when you speak about it in relation to kinesthesia.
So, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. They're wondering about the difference between potentiation and relation in the context of kinesthesia.
So I don't really understand the question, but I'll say that the kinesthesia should be at the same location as the touch sensation and the vision. So if for example, if I'm moving this arm over here, and I'm getting that sensation here, but this is my prosthetic arm, we don't think that would potentiate ownership of the arm. All 3 have to be co-located. The kinesthesia, the tactile, and the vision have to be co-located.
Thank you. I also have one question myself, because I remember citing one of your papers, Paul, about how kinesthesia alone was not really producing a strong effect of ownership. So is it the mix of kinesthesia with touch, but then wouldn't it be the factor that is crucial is touch for ownership?
Well, so it's really kind of this question of this embodiment is really made up of the 2 subcomponents of ownership and agency. And kinesthesia seems to be very high. Well, what we've demonstrated is that kinesthesia is very clearly tied into the sense of agency. So if we provide kinesthesia, you get the sense that your movement, that your muscles are contracting, that signal tells you I am the person that made this movement, and the movement was completed in the way that I had intended. Kinesthesia has what appears to be a pretty direct line right into the internal model. And so when you get that engagement with kinesthesia to the internal model, that you actually complete the actions that you initiated right? And you did it in a way that you understand, you are therefore the author of that action. That's a separate sort of, it's a separate construct than ownership, which is visual tactile integration, right? This idea that you see and you feel those, you know, when you, what you see matches with what you feel, your brain says, okay, that touch that I feel matches with what I think, you know, what I see out in the world. And so therefore that thing belongs to me. If I feel the touch from that, that's me. And that, you know, it seems that embodiment or ownership has the visual tactile integration has a strong engagement with embodiment, that you can get a larger construct of embodiment associated with it. But then if you add kinesthesia to that, which doesn't generate ownership on itself, but really provides a sense of agency, but then you put the ownership with the agency, you get a strong sense of sort of fuller, you get a fuller sense of embodiment. And that was actually one of the goals of testing this with the dynamic pick, was like, does this actually contribute to the sense of embodiment itself when they're running synergistically with each other?
Right. No, that makes sense, because thinking about it as embodiment, and if it contributing to agency, and you've probably seen what we've been discussing, how both, you know, have to be kind of there to form the full picture of embodiment, then it makes a lot of sense. So we're really glad that you have, like, the three of you have developed these metrics, and we're looking forward, once the traveling restrictions are lifted in Canada, to start that collaboration. That now we have all the paperwork set up. It took a little bit of time, but we can do that. Thank you very much for joining us today, and